Hi everyone. This is the coding half of our intro to creating cognitive tasks with jsPsych. Let's get started. So I'm on my test team where I'm creating whatever experiments I want. And we're going to create a new experiment from scratch using the jsPsych basic tutorial. So we're on the jspsych.org website. If you go to tutorials, demo experiment, simple reaction time task, this is the study that we're going to do today. Now, I'm not going to do the individual parts, creating one thing at a time. What I'm going to do is give you sort of the bigger picture of how to take each of these pieces, which I'll walk through one by one. But I'll show you sort of the focus on the integrations. So let's start with the first thing that we need to do, which is bringing in this jsPsych library. So we need the psych.js image preload, CSS, and then of course these two plugins, or three plugins. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take these, upload these 5 files into my volunteer science experiment. So first, let me go ahead and create an experiment. jsPsych example. Oops. I've already done this a couple times. Come on. Psych. I create it as a blank template. So there's no files here. So what I want to do is I want to upload the jsPsych.js file and these files. I've already done this once. In the jsPsych.js file, there's a random ellipsis that breaks our code editor. So I'm just going to, take the clean version that I've already done. So jspsych.js. Right now I'm just adding this empty file, calling it jspsych.js, so I know what it is. I'm going to paste it, and I'll show you where I got all this stuff in a second. I'll save it. So the jspsych.js files, or all these jspsych files, live on the jsPsych GitHub. These are all the files. The jspsych.js is right here at the top, the very first page. You go into it, click raw to see the raw file, and then select Control A, select all, Control C to copy, and then Control V to paste it into this. Again, for whatever reason, there's a couple of ellipses here that require a UTF-8 reader that we don't have right now. Right now we're using ASCII. So it breaks our thing. But that's the only one that does that. I'll show you how to do the other ones now. So we'll quit that. So that's saved in volunteer science. We've saved our jspsych.js file. Add a new file. So remember we need, let's see, jspsych HTML keyboard response. So let's go get that one. So you see this one's under jspsych plugins, jspsych HTML. So here's jspsych, plugins, and then HTML, Control F here. HTML keyboard. So as you see, there's a slider response, a keyboard response, and a button response. So depending on how you want people to respond to the HTML on the page, you can choose the right plugin for you. So we need keyboard response. Again, we'll go to raw. Actually, go ahead and create the file. Okay, so here's an empty file named jspsych keyboard response. As you'll notice, I lost all the hyphens because the volunteer science system doesn't allow you to save hyphens in file names. Doesn't matter to you because all these files get brought in automatically. You don't have to call them by name. So we'll save that. Quit. Next is the image file, still in the plugins. Image keyboard response, and under plugins, let's look it up. Image, here we go. Image button, keyboard slider. So keyboard. Oh, I create the file on volunteer science. Save. Oops, don't want to save yet. There we go. Now we can save. Copy and paste it over. Save. Sometimes it doesn't save, and then when it doesn't save, this will stay bolded. This is what happens if there's some kind of character in here that we don't recognize. It'll stay bolded and italicized. If that happens, know that there is something in here that can be read in ASCII. I should show you how to I'll show you how to debug that in a second. Oops. Hate when I do that. Okay, then the next one is this jsPsych preload.js. This is how you preload images, which I'll talk about in a second. But preloading images is really important for your latency. So when you're measuring how quickly somebody's responding, you don't want the system to be loading a file as part of your measurement of how long it takes for somebody to respond to an image. So the preload is really important. So this is the last plugin file. Wait, oh no. This is what happens when you talk over. Deactivate. I didn't actually find the plugin file. Oops, preload. Here we go, jsPsych preload. Pay attention to what I'm doing. Okay. Preload.js. Done. Copy paste and save. Cool. As you'll notice, the archived copy of the file of the psych images keyboard thing didn't get removed from this list. Just know that it's still inactive. It just still shows up here for now. Oh, I was going to show you how to fix how to figure out why a file isn't saving. I'll show you with the jsPsych CSS. Okay, so CSS file. Oh, which is under. Oh, it has a CSS folder. Yes. So back all the way out to the main jsPsych file directory. CSS, jsPsych CSS, raw. I need to actually create the file. This is an empty file. I'm going to copy all the CSS here. All right, save it because I know it works. But if it didn't work, there was something wrong. We could press Control-Shift-J. And this console would have an error that says cannot read character XXXYZZ. And then you highlight XXXYZZ and you do a Google search for what that character is. And then you'll find out that's like again, as an ellipsis or a strange quotation mark or a weird space. That happens a lot with Microsoft Word documents. So that's how you figure it out. Okay. So now I have the core jsPsych library files that I need. It's not the whole library. I don't need all of those files for this particular study. I just need these 5 files to make it work. So now I have these 5 files. The next thing is, so this is pulled into the tools. Now I'm going to pull in the assets. In this particular study, we only need 2 assets, which are these images. This is actually blue, and this is actually orange. So let's see. I've already saved them. I right-click on it, save image as. I already saved it as blue and orange earlier this week for the original one. So I've downloaded these already. I'll just go ahead and upload them now. Add new files, downloads. Here's blue and orange. I'll open both. There, added. And now I have my blue.png and an orange.png. Not the red.png, but orange.png. As I was in the example for the conceptual part of the workshop. So now I have the assets that I need. Now I'm going to actually create my study. So I'm going to create the core study. Let's call it main.html. For those of you who are more comfortable with JavaScript, you can do an HTML file and a separate JavaScript file that's just your JavaScript work. But I'm going to do it all in HTML. And funny enough, I think all of it's going to be JavaScript anyway. But I have to have an HTML file for the study to work for volunteer science. So I'm just going to copy the original code, and so I can show you what changes. So this has your HTML tags, and it has the head tags, the body tag. I'm going to delete all of this, so I don't need any of that. I'm going to delete the one at the bottom because I've already imported the files. So I already imported these. Because you're using volunteer science, we're already creating the HTML head tags and the body tags and the this top HTML tag for you. So all you need to do is put whatever scripts you want and whatever you want in the body. You can just type in raw HTML. Okay, so this is the core study. Let me go through it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a timeline. So this is a timeline variable. It's just that list where we're going to tell the system what tasks we want to do in what order. So we're going to create a timeline. The first element is actually going to be preloading these videos, or not the videos, the images. And the way we're going to do that, let me go ahead and change, is creating, the first thing we're going to do is create this preload variable for preloading the images. So we created a variable called preload, setting the type as preload, again using that the preload plugin. And in this case, we're going to give it a list of images. So we say we're going to preload images and this list here. Now remember, we want to use /attachment instead of /image or /img. And now this happens a couple of places. There's an img here. So I'm actually going to do a replace all. So img / attachment. Replace all. So, ta-da! All of the image URLs have been fixed. So we've created our first task in the timeline, which is going to be preloading the images. Now people aren't going to see these images. They're just going to be loaded into the person's working memory. So that way there's minimal latency when it actually comes to rendering the blue and orange circles. So we created the preload variable and we're going to add it to our timeline. In JavaScript, you can add something to a list using the .push function. So timeline.push preload. So now we've already created our first thing in our timeline, preloading the images. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the welcome screen. So we create a variable called welcome. The type is HTML keyboard response. So we're going to show somebody HTML and we're going to wait for a keyboard response. In this case, we're just going to say, hey, the stimulus that what people are going to see is the welcome message. Welcome to the experiment. Press any key to begin. And note we're not defining any keys, which means that any key somebody presses will advance the person to the next part of the timeline. So we create the variable welcome and we push it to the timeline. We're already 2 steps into our timeline. The next thing we're going to do is create instructions. So again, we're going to use the HTML keyboard response type. So we're going to display this HTML, and anybody can press whatever keyboard, because we're not defining what the responses can be. So any key is going to advance to the next page. Now note this is HTML, it's not just a string, so you can put in the p anchor or the div or strong to format your text, and we'll see what that all looks like in a second. So you put in your HTML here. Post-trial gap is after you press the button, it's going to wait 2,000 milliseconds or 2 seconds to actually go on to the next part of the timeline. So we've created our instructions block, and instruction task, and we are now pushing it to the timeline here in line 40. All right, now this is the more complicated piece. So creating the actual trial block. This is 30 lines of code. So bear with me. In the big picture, we are putting together the stimulus, putting together the fixation. So if you're not familiar with these kinds of tasks, what you do is you show a stimulus, and then you show a fixation, which is sort of like a palate cleanser, a mental resting period that allows people to sort of reset. Typically, it's a plus symbol or called a cross, a fixation cross. I'll talk about that more in a second, but just so you know what that is. So we create the test stimuli, the fixation, and then we create a test. So this will actually be the what each individual trial is going to be composed of, where we're showing the stimulus and expecting them to press the F or J keys. And then we're creating the last thing that we created, this test procedure where we say we're going to do fixation, then test, and we're going to do that 5 times. So like I said, let me walk you through this line by line. So we can create the test stimuli where we say the stimulus are these images. If we wanted to do HTML, we could say stimulus and then have the HTML here. If we want to do audio, we could do stimulus and then a link to the audio file that we would have uploaded to Volunteer Science. And for each individual or unique stimulus, we want to tell jsPsych what the correct response is. In this case, the F key or the J key, or if you wanted to change keys, you can do that. But you set those keys here. So that's how you formulate the stimuli. Next, we're going to format the fixation. So fixation is sort of a standalone, fixation and test are standalone tasks. So it's going to be an HTML keyboard response task where the stimulus is just this cross, just the plus symbol at a 60-point font size. Choices, you say jsPsych no keys. So what that means is it won't take any kind of response. Like you can press whatever key you want and nothing's going to happen. So if you want to force people to sit and look at something, this is how you do it. jsPsych no keys, no underscore keys. Next, we're going to do trial duration. So because you can't press a button, we had to tell jsPsych when the trial's over. So you say trial duration. You can set a particular time and just say 200 milliseconds or 2000 milliseconds. In this case, we're using a randomization function. So say jsPsych randomization, sample without replacement. So just pulling from this list. So it's 250 milliseconds, which is 0.25 seconds. 500 milliseconds, all the way up to 2000 milliseconds, which is a full 2 seconds. So we're sampling one of these, and we're taking the 0th result of that. So it would pull out a list. In this case, the list only has one item in it, the first item. And lastly, we're attaching a piece of data to this that says this is a fixation task. So that means that when we go to look at our data, we can just filter all of that stuff out. Or we can keep it in if we wanted to test whether the delay in fixation affects somebody's response. The last sort of unit, and as part of this, is the test page. So the test type is going to be image keyboard. So we're going to show an image and get a keyboard response. The stimulus is pulling from jsPsych timeline variable stimuli, which is actually going to be set here. So we see timeline variables, test stimuli, which is up here. So if you saw the presentation, I said this was being defined elsewhere. This is how it's being defined. You said the choices here as well. So I've already set up here the correct responses are F and J, but if you want to have people have more responses valid within this test, you could theoretically add them here. I'm not sure why, but you could. Spacebar, maybe, for example, if you wanted people to be able to skip a question. Next, you add a piece of data. So we're going to say, add a new column called task, where that's called what the result here is response. Another column for correct response, where you save whether they should have pressed F or J. And then when it's finished, we're going to save whether they were correct, or sorry, we can create data for whether they were correct. In this case, we're matching the data.response, which is created automatically from the jsPsych core file. You're going to match it to data.correctResponse, which again is part of the jsPsych core library, but it's tied to this. So what did they press match what we told them the correct response was going to be? And lastly, we're just going to put all of these three together into one block, or one task. So we'll call this object test procedure. It has its own timeline, which is fixation and test. The timeline variables have already been set. by test stimuli. And then we're going to repeat this 5 times, and randomize order is true. So we'll randomize which procedure gets done first. And lastly, we just push the test procedure to the timeline. So it's sort of like a timeline with a timeline object in it. The last thing is you're going to create this debrief block, which is just saying the experiment's over. This is how accurate and quick you were. So again, we're going to do an HTML keyboard response. So we're going to show somebody some text, and we're going to move on when somebody presses a button. So the stimulus here is a little complex. It's a whole function. Now the function just returns a little bit of HTML, but the reason we do a function is so that we can calculate the accuracy. So we say, how many trials were there? So you say jsPsych.get, filtering on whether it was a response task. Correct trials, you filter for whether the trial has the correct variable set to true. The accuracy takes the correct trials over the total number of trials, and then reaction time gives the correct trials. This is like really going into the depths of the data structure, but just so you know, pulls out the mean of the reaction time. And then spits it out as a piece of HTML. So you responded correctly on print the accuracy variable, percent of trials. Your average response time was print reaction time, ms. And then press any key to finish the experiment. So this is the debrief block. When we're done creating it, we're adding it to using timeline.push. And at that point, we're done with our timeline. So we have a timeline that starts by loading these images, adds the welcome screen, adds the instructions, and adds the test procedure, and then adds this debrief block. The last thing we're going to do then is call this jsPsych init function. And again, this is where we're going to use some specific volunteer science magic to save data to our server and set it to render the study in our particular experiment. So let me go ahead and save this. One thing about volunteer science is that volunteer science also has an initialize function. And the reason we do this is that when you're loading a bunch of code, a lot of times you want to be able to load in a bunch of functions, calculate a lot of variables before you actually start your study. And the best way to control that is to use an initialize function, which is exactly what jsPsych.init is doing. Volunteer science has the same thing. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to put all of this in the volunteer science initialize function. Now volunteer science calls initialize, but we don't define it. So we load all the code and then we say, call the initialize function. If there isn't one defined, then we just sort of skip it. It's sort of empty. But if you define it, this is what happens. So in a big picture, we're going to load all these files in, and then we're going to call initialize, which means this whole series of JavaScript gets called. So study loads, call initialize, the timeline gets created, and then we're going to call jsPsych.init. So here the timeline is set to timeline. Remember, we want to save, and I need to just copy paste this stuff so I don't screw up the don't create a typo. So set display element to main and test. Full screen is true. I think it's the default, but we'll add it in. And I will also add in these functions. Sorry, sometimes when you copy in code, it doesn't line up. Here we go. It doesn't even matter whether it lines up. It's just aesthetically nice. It's easier to read. So again, full screen true. When the trial finishes, we're going to say, pull out the jsPsych data get last trial and save it as a .csv format. And then when the whole study finishes, we're going to call function data experiment complete. Make it look nice. There we go. Okay, and that should be it. So let's go ahead and try this. When I did this live, it screwed up, and I don't remember why. Nope. All right. So that's it. It works. So I can press any key to begin. That was the welcome screen. Here's the instructions. Again, this is like that HTML block. Oh, shoot, I forgot. J and F, I think it is. Uh-oh. I don't remember which one is which. As you can see, the timing is also varying, so you can see how it's randomly sending out 2 seconds versus half a second. Oops. I think that might have been the only right one. Oh, nope, I remember correctly. Okay, good. So I was correct 80% of the time, so I missed one. My average response time was 620 milliseconds. And now I can press any key to finish. And now the study's over. And the data is saved over here. So even when you post it live and you collect real data, it's still saved here. You can see that's the XML version of our. That's easiest to see. So here's the round. So RT stimulus response. Oh, this is the fixation. So each row of this will have the header, so stimulus response task, and then the actual data. So reaction time was 272 seconds. Stimulus was blue PNG. Response was F. The task was a response. The correct response was F. So you see I'm reading it off the thing here. Trial type is image keyboard response. Trial index, I don't know if that means 10. Time elapsed, so 20,000 seconds from the beginning of the entire time. Internal node ID is this, which I've never used. And was I correct? Yes, I was in fact correct. Where's the one that I missed? Down here. The reaction time there was 537, so it's pretty slow. This is actually really fast. That was a really fast reaction time. All right, so that's it. If you wanted to download this data, you can go, you do the filtering. I usually like to do JSON, but you can also do CSV. AMT, fine. Principal investigators, yeah, sure. Show us 5. All right, this is fine. Export. And now I have just a CSV that I can copy and paste. You'll notice there's some weird, this actually renders in HTML, so it renders like the new lines. But I can come over here and paste this directly into Excel, or right-click it and right-click and say Save As, and save it as a .csv file. All right, that's it for the tutorial. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out at support@volunteerscience.com, or you can email me directly at jason_radford@volunteerscience.com. Thank you so much.